So number one question here I've got is, in the 5C structure, what stops the listener doing exactly the same as your buyer and going straight to the insights? Perfect. Well, I would say, think about knowing your audience. If that's what your buyer really wants to do, then actually you shouldn't waste your time trying to set the scene or set out the current situation. So what I would do is probably just send it out as a pre-read. If you're spending all your time producing lots of current situation charts and actually your buyer's just going straight to recommendations, send the current situation stuff as a pre-read, put it through into the appendix, and actually utilize that time you have with your audience to really focus on the bits that they really want to talk about. Thank you for that question. Got another question here. What tends to be the safe option for unknowns, or when we have not had the opportunity to question to find out what's important for them, i.e. a new buyer? That's a really good question. So if it's a blank relationship, one that you've not necessarily had one before, I would say, and this is going to take a bit more work, but plan for all eventualities. So what I used to do was have all the information at hand, but actually at the same time be able to pivot very quickly and hone in on certain areas that I knew that the buyer was picking up on during the meeting. So for example, if they really wanted to delve into the action plan section, they really wanted to look at actually how would I bring that to life, I would cut short some of the current situation slides and I would go straight into that. Or alternatively, if they're a new buyer, then they might appreciate a bit of market context, and so that current situation bit is super important. So I spend a bit more time with that buyer talking about that if that's really where their interests lie. But again, until you really see the whites of their eyes and you're on the other side of the table, then actually I would say try and plan for all eventualities. Okay, question number 3. Are there any no-nos when presenting the insight? I would say the only no-nos are if they haven't been tested or stress tested. So think about the why questioning framework and technique. In essence, what we want to try and do is present an insight. Think about shoppers, consumers, customers, need, want, value. What are those barriers that you've uncovered or looked to unlock within your insight? The no-no would just be to assume that a graph with a downward trajectory is your insight. It's not. Actually, it's a symptom of something. So you need to go in and make sure you're presenting an insight itself. So that's what I'd say to that question. Thank you very much. Do you have any tips for presenting or engaging when you do not know the audience? I always like, and it's just a personal thing, but when I don't know the audience, I like to start off with a bit of patter. I joke about the weather earlier, but I like to talk a little bit about the weather. I talk a little about how the traffic is. I moan about the parking, but actually that really softens people a little bit when you start having a bit of a banter beforehand. And then actually, then when you start engaging with them, actually it becomes a little bit more personal. So think about actually what types of conversations, what might be stimulating, how could you engage them with conversation and topics. The other thing I like to do is actually, when I used to deal with buyers, is look them up on LinkedIn. So I would know in the back of my head where they come from, what companies they'd worked at. And actually, again, ways of engaging them. You might think about actually thinking about where they used to work and talk about some of the challenges they had previously in their old lives. Thank you for that. Another question, when designing slides, how would you recommend using text, graphs, pictures, and stats to have an engaging deck? Yeah, what I would say is have a balance. Know your audience. If your audience is very analytical and very logical, then I'd say graphs, stats, text, all really applicable. But then think about if somebody's very conceptual, actually big images on screen, blue sky, those types of things might be more applicable at that point. In terms of what's an engaging deck, there probably isn't a one size fits all. Really think about, like we've been talking about over this presentation, is what's right for the audience. And that's what I'd say in terms of designing your slides. Thank you for that. A few more questions. What is the relationship between an insight and a recommendation? Really good question. What I would say is an insight is, again, I'll repeat it, a shopper, consumer, customer, need, want, value. But actually within that sentence that you start then padding out, there should be an implicit action in there. So actually, if you read that insight statement, you should kind of know what the recommendation should be. But an insight statement itself isn't the action plan. It'll guide the action plan. So actually what you should do is think about actually making an insight statement that is implicit in its very nature, but the recommendation itself would sit within the action plan. What would you do after seeing that opportunity being presented? Thank you for that. A really kind of pertinent question. How do you use 5C current situation if you're trying to get new business and don't have budget to buy data? Actually, a really great question. I was going to put this in as a slide actually, which is what we observe at the IGD are kind of two companies, and they kind of sit in two kind of broad buckets, which is those that are drowning in data and information and those that don't have enough of it. What is absolutely key though is just because you have more data and information, it doesn't necessarily mean you produce better insights. Actually, the perennial challenge across all businesses really is, whether it's data paralysis or data famine, is crafting compelling insights themselves. So what I'd say is, if you don't have budget to buy data, then think about how you could leverage the expertise that is within your organization. Speak to people, talk to customers, talk to your shoppers and consumers, because actually that doesn't take a lot of money to do. And actually, if you start understanding some of their need, wants and values, that'll help you unlock some of the insights. Great question here. What's your view on the differences between insight and foresight? An insight, we would say, would be forward-looking, similar to a foresight. And actually, we kind of class it as hindsight and foresight as well. But yeah, a really kind of great point there, which is, what is the difference between insight and foresight? What we say is they're very much the same. You know, insight should be forward-looking. And actually, if we think about the sources of data that you utilize to get to an insight, what you probably want to do is get a mixture of lag and lead indicators in the building and constructing of your insight. So a simple lead indicator might be sales are up, market shares down, those types of things, EPOS data, stuff that's already happened and you're reporting on. A lead indicator would be something that's happening at a macro level. That might be, for example, smoking rate declines. It might be obesity rates. It might be car ownership. Those type of things will then have a knock-on effect in terms of then driving some of those lag indicators that I talked about earlier. So get a nice balance of lag and lead will help you define actually a great forward-looking insight. Okay, another question here. Do you have any recommendations on the number of slides in a presentation? I'm going to give a standard answer is, how long is a piece of string? But what I would also say is, think about how much time you have. So for example, if you've only got 15 minutes in front of your audience, then actually, 100 slides is probably too much. And then actually, when is it enough? Well, actually, if you think about your audience and really know your audience, if I'm presenting to a very conceptual person, I might only have 1 or 2 slides, but actually be prepared to have a great conversation. So actually, utilizing slides might not be that important. So in terms of how many slides would I recommend in a presentation, I think really understand and build to the audience that you're speaking to. Lots of great questions, thank you. Do you have any tips on how to encourage buyers to tell you what's on their mind without firing questions at them? This is a great question. So actually, how do you understand what's on your buyers' minds without firing lots of questions? What I suggest is the softly approach, and that's always kind of worked for me. I think relationships are very personal, and actually, if you can try to understand the person in terms of what motivates them, whether it's a promotion, whether it's to hit their bonus, whatever it is, actually understand them, what motivates them, will really help you unlock actually what's on their minds. Because if we think about, we might not ask the question, what's keeping you awake at night? We might actually frame that to be, how are you performing business wise at the moment, and what are your key KPIs? It's outperformance. Brilliant. Okay, and how are you doing on that? And what happens if you don't deliver that? Oh, that means X, Y, and Z. So actually, if you think about from a personal level, actually how to really understand what's underpinning their behavior, that would be a great way to go about it. Brilliant question on this one. How do you build a deck when you have a mixed audience of analytical and conceptual? A really great question. And actually a situation, no doubt, that you'll face a lot when we present to audiences, because we're probably not just presenting on one person at a time. What I would say is look at the balance of the audience. If it's half and half, then you need to strike the right balance and actually think about, before you even go into that presentation, how you could probably mitigate a lot of things by sending through pre-reads. But if you've really got a mixed bag of audience, they're analytical, they're logical, they're conceptual, whatever dimensions they are, really think about making sure everybody gets something out of that meeting. What I would say is do not focus overly on delivering lots of analytical stuff in terms of graphs, data, information for the analytical buyer, and then completely forget about time to talk about the big ideas with the conceptual buyer in the room, maybe. So what I would say is strike a balance between the two, and then that way you'll make sure that you're covering off all the bases. How can we best tell a story when the deck is submitted in advance as a pre-read? Okay, so if you need to send through your presentation beforehand as a pre-read, then I would say try and think about how would you want to spend your time within that meeting that you have. So for example, again, use that 5C framework to say, okay, so they've seen the pre-read. Depending on the type of buyer they are, maybe they want to spend more time thinking about how they'll bring it to life. So if they're a logical person, then maybe they've read all of your kind of current situations, they've seen your insights, and then they want to spend more time actually thinking and talking about how to bring it to life. In which case, that's how I use the actual session itself. If you need to send through a pre-read, brilliant. It doesn't mean you need to pre-present it. It just means that you have more time to actually talk about certain areas that you think would be useful. Great. A few more questions. Last few. Would you recommend having key insights and a summary slide at the front or the back of the deck? Excellent. What I would say is, again, I think it's similar to the question that was asked earlier, is think about your audience. If you've got a buyer that literally wants to go straight to the insights and you know that's how they like to operate, then I'll absolutely put that in the front of the slide. Because actually there's no point in wasting yours and theirs time going through lots of current situations. If they trust you, for example, and they see exactly the same numbers from other organizations. So actually, why not just spend time thinking about the insights and sharing that right up front? Alternatively, if you've got a real analytical buyer, like we talked about earlier, then you're going to need to spend a bit of time going through the justifications of that insight or the building blocks of that insight. And so what I wouldn't do is put the insight straight in at the front of the page, because actually that might then draw their attention. They'll start asking difficult questions and start probing into the detail and actually spoil the flow a little bit of your presentation. So really think about how you manage and where you place it in terms of the insight is really dependent on the audience itself. Should I include the whys to show where the insight has come from? Yes, I think so. I think if we think about shoppers, consumers, customers, need, want, value, actually what we're really talking about is unlocking or looking at barriers, triggers, etc. to entry. So if we're really thinking about the whys, actually, in a way, the insight statement itself should be talking a little bit about the whys, but you should be supplementing that a little bit, whether it be through pre-reads or in the actual presentation itself, to really build up to the why, to really justify why it's existing. I think last question. What are your thoughts around closing? To what level should you summarize the insight again? Yeah, I think when we think about close, is you need to summarize everything that's been discussed. But really, when I think about close, it's what are the next points? What are the next things after the actual presentation or meeting that you need to do next? And yes, you could summarize the insight, important. However, you also need to summarize your action plan. What's the next steps? Who's going to be involved? What are you going to do? What are your commitments? And really thinking about actually those next steps is what I think about when you think about the close.